Thanks very much for inviting me here today. I'm actually very excited about it, even though it might not appear as such. But yeah, I'm Randy Jackson. I'm going to talk to you today about Indigenous data sovereignty, but I'm going to do that in the context of STBBI research. And more specifically, it's about how this work is about relational futures and responsibilities. Um, so the goal today is to share what I think are principles of Indigenous data sovereignty. I already think that you already know a lot about this, particularly if you've been doing Indigenous research in the past, which relied heavily on things like OCAP. It's important to also know too that OCAP is First Nation specific, and Métis and Inuit have their own kinds of frameworks to do work with them. But here I'm talking about First Nations. And so I want to share how research governance um, where Indigenous sovereignty is part, Indigenous data sovereignty is part of research governance, and particularly when we attach it to an Indigenous research frameworks, what happens is we become grounded in land and relationality and responsibility, and that can transform not just how data is handled, but it can also transform entire research systems and how they operate. But ultimately, this is a conversation about futures. It's about how we build data systems that honor Indigenous laws and ways of knowing. It's about it's about how we shift sort of extractive practices to more relational ones. And it's about how we ensure research is done in ways that strengthen communities rather than reproduce harm. So thank you for being here. I am really honored to be sharing this space with you. If I can just get the next slide here. Okay, to situate the presentation, we need to understand why Indigenous data sovereignty is so critical in STBBI research. And so let's have a closer look here at the current landscape. So first, Indigenous communities continue to face disproportionate burdens of STBBI. These disparities are not about individual behavior, so much more so they're the result of colonial determinants of health. And what I mean by that is dispossession, poverty, housing insecurity, etc., systemic racism, healthcare, and the ongoing impacts of residential schools and child welfare. And it's important to note too that colonization has not ended, it continues on. And so when we talk about addressing certain things with respect to Indigenous health, we must also center on structures that also need to shift. Okay, so second, data systems that surround STBBI and HIV research are built around ideas of surveillance, right? They rely on things like risk categorization, case reporting, contact tracing, all in all, sort of a deficit framing of who Indigenous communities are. So these systems were not designed with Indigenous peoples in mind, and they certainly were not designed to uphold Indigenous data sovereignty. Third, most of the epidemiological research and research infrastructure that governs STBBI research is institutionally controlled. And what I mean by that is universities, public health units, provincial ministries, federal agencies set the rules. And it's not set by Indigenous nations, organizations, elders, or knowledge keepers. And maybe we should consider that. But because of this, Indigenous data often circulates in ways that communities have not consented to. Data moves back and forth. Data moves between agencies, into models, into publications, into policy spaces, sort of without any Indigenous governance control or benefit. The circulation shapes narratives, about who's at risk, who's responsible, and where resources should flow. And this issue becomes even more urgent when we think about Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer peoples. Their experiences are routinely underrepresented or misrepresented in STBBI datasets if they appear at all. So data systems often collapse gender and sexuality categories and in ways that erase Indigenous understanding of identity and relationality. Among these challenges, Indigenous data sovereignty movements have emerged as transformative forces. It's actually a global movement at this point. They are reshaping how health, identity, community well-being should inform research governance. Indigenous data sovereignty, which I'll call IDS, asks us to reimagine STBBI research, not through the lens of surveillance and deficit, but through sovereignty, relational accountability, cultural continuity, and community-defined research priorities. And I think that this sort of sets the background or the stage for why we need new governance models, models that are grounded in Indigenous law, Indigenous authority, and Indigenous responsibility. Next slide, please. So I want to walk through what I think are core principles of an Indigenous data sovereignty. These are the foundational ideas that guide how data should be collected, governed, interpreted, and shared with Indigenous peoples involved. So the first principle, unsurprisingly, is self-determination. Indigenous nations here in Canada and globally have inherent pre-existing rights to govern their own data. This includes the right to determine what information is collected, how it is held, and how it is used. If you're familiar with OCAP, you'll be familiar with some of what I'm going to say here. But it's important to acknowledge, though, that self-determination is grounded in Indigenous law. It appears in treaty relationships, those conversations, but it's also been supported internationally with frameworks such as UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. I think I might have got that wrong, but anyways, you understand. In STBBI and HIV research, this challenges the assumptions that institutions are the natural stewards of Indigenous data. And so we know that can shift. The second principle here is collective benefit. So Indigenous data sovereignty requires that data produce direct material and cultural benefits to communities or for communities, and not just for researchers, funders, or institutions. This shift from being something taken from communities to something that is returned as value. Let me just say that one more time. This shifts data from being something taken from communities to something that returns value through either healing, capacity building, community priorities, and improving well-being for future generations. Just hold on, okay. Third principle is the authority to control. So Indigenous people must have authority over how data is collected, stored, interpreted, and shared. This includes control over the very the categories that STBBI research relies on. What counts as an indicator, how risk is defined, how gender and sexuality are understood, and how communities are represented in analysis. Without this authority, data can easily reproduce colonial logics and harmful narratives. And these principles, self-determination, collective benefit, and authority control, are the backbone of Indigenous data sovereignty. They remind us fundamentally, they require us to fundamentally rethink who's holding the power over the data, how are those decisions being made, and what responsibilities guide the entire research life cycle. Okay, second slide. Next slide, sorry. Oh, so continuing from that, what I said, where where Indigenous data sovereignty, the site of it sits, right? We have also this idea of authority to control. And that means that Indigenous peoples determine how knowledge are collected, stored, interpreted, and shared. It means Indigenous nations and communities, and not institutions, decide what counts as data, how categories are defined, and how indicators are interpreted, especially in the area of STBBI and HIV, where categories often misrepresent or erase Indigenous realities. This principle directly challenges the assumptions that universities, public health units, or government agency should automatically hold jurisdiction over Indigenous data. Instead, authority rests with communities, and I'm talking here about elders, knowledge keepers, two-spirit and indigenous leaders, Indigenous research, and Indigenous governance bodies. The next principle, responsibility and reciprocity, remind us that data are not net neutral objects, right? Indigenous data is relational, right? They come from people, they come from families, territories, and lived experiences. And because of this, researchers carry obligations to care for the data, to maintain transparency, to revisit consent throughout the research process, and to ensure that benefits flow back to the community. This principle reframes research as a relationship and not as a transaction. It says if you work with Indigenous data, you are entering into what Sean Wilson called as relational accountability. And it's that accountability that must be honored across the entire life cycle of the project. The fifth principle is, I think, transformative, because it articulates a principle where ethics become rooted in Indigenous law. It moves beyond the limits of institutional ethic board, which focus on paperwork and compliance. Indigenous ethics are often grounded in ceremony and community governance, in teachings about respect, reciprocity, kingship, and obligations to the land and to the ancestors. Ethical decisions must be guided by Indigenous laws and protocols, and not only, and I'm going to emphasize, not only Western institutional ethical frameworks. And finally, this idea of protection and possession ensures that data are housed and governed within Indigenous controlled systems. This is essential not only for sovereignty, but for cultural safety. It prevents data from being extracted, circulated without consent, misinterpreted, or used in ways that harm communities. Protection and possession remind us that stewardship requires infrastructure. Indigenous data platforms, Indigenous governance systems, and long-term community oversight. So these four principles, authority to control, responsibility and reciprocity, ethics that are grounded in Indigenous laws, and in Indigenous protections and possession, sort of complete what you might think about as a model for Indigenous data sovereignty. They fundamentally reorient STBBI HIV research away from surveillance and deficit models towards sovereignty, relationship, and community care. Can I have the next slide, please? So, to understand why Indigenous data sovereignty matters so deeply in HIV STBBI research, I think that we need to start with the reality that Indigenous peoples have faced decades of extractive and deficit-based research practices. In STBBI and HIV fields in particular, data has often been collected without Indigenous sovereignty being centered, without Indigenous oversight, and without meaningful relational accountability. And if you take anything away from today focus on relational accountability and understanding what that means. But just to continue, much of this data collection has been framed through a surveillance lens. Again, who's at risk, who's compliant, who's contributing to transmission, rather than asking how colonial conditions shape and continue to shape health. Right? It's a misstep to do it otherwise. So conventional research governance, I almost call it colonial research governance, might have been a slip, but anyways, continue to rely on bureaucratic, linear, and colonial systems that simply do not reflect Indigenous laws, protocols, or relational worldviews. These systems often prioritize institutional needs around reporting, around funding cycles, administrative efficiency, and this is done over Indigenous rights, responsibilities, and self-determination. So Indigenous sovereignty movements, and I'm talking here about OCAP or the CARE principles, or even UNDRIC, directly challenge these structures back. They push back against them. They affirmed that Indigenous peoples have the right to govern how data about their bodies, their lives, and their communities are collected, interpreted, stored, and shared. And that's not a technical detail. It's an expression of sovereignty, right? Indigenous governance models are fundamentally relational, place-based, and holistic. They emphasize responsibilities to the land, to kin, to our kingship, to our ancestors, but also towards future generations. So they're not simply rights, they're responsibilities that we as Indigenous peoples hold. So when we apply these governance models to STBBI research, we start to see how we're shifting from seeing data as information to be extracted to seeing data as relations that need to be cared for. And this, here is like a 5-element. Sorry, I'm getting lost here. I want to talk a little bit about I lost my thought. Hold on. So I think this is where the 5-element framework becomes really helpful. And I'm going to unpack that on the next slide. But before we go there, I just want to quickly say that land, fire, water, fire, air, and spirit remind us that governance should be a living, balanced system and not a set of procedures or checkboxes. So I need to say that. The elements give us a way to think about data governance that is grounded in place, relational accountability, transformation, voice, and ceremony. So this matters for HIV and STBBI research because Indigenous lives are shaped by the data systems that we build. So we want research to support healing, justice, sovereignty, and community well-being, then we must shift how data are governed, and return authority to Indigenous hands. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I just wanted to show very quickly how the 5 elements help us understand Indigenous data sovereignty and why it matters in research. So land. Land teaches Indigenous peoples, it grounds us. It's about accountability as well. It reminds us too that research must be rooted in place, in territorial laws, and community priorities, local responsibilities. So in STBBI research, this means decisions cannot be made solely by institutions or epidemiological models. They must be led by the nations whose land we are working on. The idea of water as an element is really about flow, it's about renewal, it's about connection, right? So governance should flow through relationships and not through rigid hierarchies. So in practice, this looks like flexible, relational, transparent governance processes where communication moves like water, openly, continuously, and in ways that nourish relationships. Fire is used to refer to transformation, to courage, and to vision. Fire brings courage, it asks us to be willing to transform systems that cause harm, including surveillance heavy STBBI data practices. Fire pushes us towards regenerative, justice-centered governance that refuses deficit-based framings and challenging colonial histories without sort of any discussion of strengths that people bring to this. Air is about communications, it's about breadth, it's about story. And this teaches that governance must center listening, transparency, and shared consent. And for HIV STBBI research, this means ensuring that elders, knowledge keeper, and especially two-spirit indigenous people can speak into how their data are understood and represented. The fifth element, spirit, is really about ceremony, it's about balance, and it's about relational law. Spirit integrates everything. It holds together ceremony, relational law, and ethical balance. Spirit teaches that research governance is not simply procedural, but Indigenous data sovereignty is ceremonial. It requires reflection, gratitude, reciprocity, and accountability to the ancestors and to future generations. And so together, these elemental teachings reframe data governance as a living system and not as an institutional protocol. This is why Indigenous data sovereignty matters for HIV STBBI research, because it offers a governance framework rooted in relationship, balance, and responsibility. A framework that fundamentally challenges us how data is collected, interpreted, and used, and who gets to decide all of that. Can I get the next slide, please? And I think I have about 15 minutes left. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. I only have 3 slides left. Okay. So now that we've outlined, or now that I've outlined sort of the core principles of Indigenous data sovereignty, I want to turn towards what these principles ask of us. What kinds of transformations are needed in STBBI research, and what it means to move from colonial data environment into an Indigenous governed data future. So the first major shift is the creation of Indigenous governed data or Indigenous governed data systems. This means that data about Indigenous peoples, whether it's biological, epidemiological, geographic, or narrative, cannot continue to live on institutional servers governed by non-Indigenous policies. Indigenous data must be held in infrastructures that are controlled by nations, organizations, and Indigenous governed institutions. I'm about to have a conversation with my own university about this. But for next week, that's going to happen. But anyways, for STBBI work, this fundamentally changes who has stewardship over HIV testing data, incidence and prevalence models, viral suppression indicators, contact tracing information, and qualitative narratives. So instead of institutional keepers, and I'm talking here about universities, public health units, federal health agencies, the authority rests with Indigenous communities. Data stewardship becomes an expression of jurisdiction, law, and administrative function. Second, research governance itself must become relational. Most governance frameworks today mirror colonial public administration that uses linear processes, rigid committees, procedural ethics, and bureaucratic timelines. But Indigenous governance is based on responsibility, relationality, and balance. It places elders, knowledge keepers, two-spirit Indigenous leaders, and community as decision makers at the center and not at the margin. Research decisions are guided by ceremony, by protocol, by land-based ethics, and by obligations to kinship and community. And in practice, this means that in governance bodies um, oversee not only approvals, but the relationships that hold that research together. They guide how harms are prevented, how benefits should circulate, and how the spirit of the research is maintained. Third, we must transform how we are looking at or how we measure success. Many STBBI indicators, incidence rates, risk category, positivity trends, these were developed without Indigenous worldviews in mind, and they often reinforce narratives of deficit or of surveillance. Indigenous data sovereignty requires community-defined indicators, measures that reflect things like cultural continuity, relational well-being, safety for two-spirit indigenous peoples, connection to land, kingship, ceremony, and self-determination. And when I'm teaching Indigenous health at an undergraduate level at McMaster, I often start by asking students, first what they know about Indigenous health and what they know about colonization. And then I say something along the lines of, well, we've survived colonization for 500 years. We're still here. We're still actively present. Are you not the least bit curious about how that was done? Right. So again, a shift to community defined indicators is really, really an important thing to do, because this shift allows us to look at pathology, from pathology towards sovereignty, towards what enables communities not only to survive, but to thrive. Because quite frankly, at the end of the day, we didn't just survive colonialism to just be here. We actually want thriving lives in the future. That's why we did that, right? So next slide, please. Fourth, consent should no longer be considered a one-time event, right? We typically do that when we meet with participants at the first step. And so colonial research ethics system treats consent as a signature, right? Indigenous governance understands consent as a relationship, something renewed, revisited, renegotiated as the research evolves. So in STBBI research, where data often circulate widely through network analysis, surveillance systems, algorithmic modeling, ongoing consent ensures that communities continue to have agency over how their data move and what meanings are produced. Fifth is interpretation matters as much as collection, right? And it's actually one of the most powerful sites of colonization in research, right? Who analyzes the data determines what the data means, which narratives get amplified and which futures become possible and which futures gets closed off. So Indigenous data sovereignty demands Indigenous-led analysis conducted by Indigenous researchers, two-spirit Indigenous scholars, youth, community leaders, and partners who hold relational accountability. And this is where I would slide allied involvement in here as well. So this is transformative in STBBI work because it resists the deficit narratives that statistical models often produce. Indigenous-led interpretations centers strength, relational determinants, community knowledge, and structural change. So it's really, I think if anything, this is probably the most important. 6, ethics must be grounded in Indigenous law, right? So Indigenous or Western ethics boards tend to focus on procedural compliance. They rarely, if at all, address ceremony, relational harm, kinship obligations or land-based responsibilities. Indigenous data sovereignty requires ethical frameworks rooted in Indigenous law carried through stories, through protocols, ceremonies, and land teachings. This means ethics cannot be reduced to review. Ethics must be lived, practiced, and accountable to the community. And finally, I want to note that transformation is none of that transformation that I'm talking about is possible without equitable partnerships and resourcing. It's going to cost money, people, in terms of implementing the TRC, for example. That's going to cost money. But anyways, Indigenous-led governance, research governance requires long-term funding, infrastructure, training pathways, and authorities. And too often, Indigenous work is underfunded, short-term, or dependent on non-Indigenous systems. True transformation means shifting power and resources, including funding, staffing, data infrastructures, analytic authority, and decision-making to Indigenous governance bodies. All of these shifts, Indigenous data, systems, relational governance, community-defined indicators, ongoing consent, Indigenous-led analysis, Indigenous ethical law, and sustaining resources, all of these come together as a unified transformation. They move us from extractive, deficit-based, surveillance-oriented practices to a future where Indigenous sovereignty, well-being, and fluidity shape every step of the every step of the STBBI research. And this is what Indigenous data sovereignty demands. And this is what we mean. This is what it means to do research, not just on Indigenous communities, but with and for Indigenous peoples in a good, relational, and sovereign supporting kind of way. Next slide, please. This is the last one. So we come to a close here. I want to return to the heart of Indigenous data sovereignty that I talked about a bit earlier. So this work is not about databases, indicators, or governance structures, although they do matter, right? Indigenous data sovereignty is about our relationships to community, to land, to story, to one another, and to the future generations we are accountable to. In STBBI HIV research, data have too often been used as tools of surveillance, deficit framing, and administrative control. All, I might add, support continued colonialism, or it can do that. But Indigenous data sovereignty asks us to flip that logic completely. It asks us to treat data not as objects that can be collected, but as relations that must be cared for. It insists that data carry responsibilities to honor dignity, to uphold sovereignty, and to advance well-being. The principles that I talked about today, self-determination, collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and Indigenous law, these are things that guide us towards research systems rooted in balance and accountability. They invite us to imagine a data future where Indigenous peoples define the questions, governing the processes, and interpret the meanings. And for transformation approaches, we mapped Indigenous data governance systems, relational governance models, community-defined indicators, ongoing consent, Indigenous-led analysis. These are not sort of abstract ideals, right? These are practices that exist right here, right now. So they are doable. They are already being built into communities, into two-spirit indigenous networks, and into Indigenous research centers. But transformation requires courage, real courage. It asks us to name the limitations of the current system. It asks us to challenge the colonial logics that are embedded in Indigenous within institutions, right? And it requires us to think about power and authority, right? To shift power, resources, and authority back to Indigenous governance. So Indigenous data sovereignty calls for us to create research futures where Indigenous nations and community hold full authority over how lives, stories, and bodies are represented. So futures where data practices support or strengthen community well-being, where futures where research is ceremony, grounded in land, water, air, fire, and spirit. And this is how we move from extraction to reciprocity, from risk narratives to relational determinants, from surveillance to sovereignty. And ultimately, I think, and I believe this, right, that Indigenous data sovereignty is how we ensure that Indigenous peoples not only survive in our data systems, but they actually will thrive there. And that's it for me. Thank you.